Firstly, thank you to all of you. This is a first for me in a number of ways. For starters, I've never had four guests. It's usually just three and myself. So if I'm operating the mute button, please do not be offended. It just means that it's going to be tricky for me in editing. So I've got all the time in the world. I know most of you probably don't, but I'm here to listen. I'd love for you to take your time to explain your viewpoints. We're going to obviously, with so many people, allow everyone to speak, which is exciting. The other reason why this is new for me is I don't know a lot about this subject. Usually when I go in, I at least have some confidence that I can offer something, which is, I think, why it's usually just myself and three guests. But in this case, I really don't have much to offer at this point, and all I'm looking for is clarity. This is a very selfish episode for me. I just want to understand, because what I see right now on the internet and in discussions around camp is a lot of arguing between people that I love and respect on both quote unquote sides, and I don't understand. So I'm hoping today to just understand. I know nothing is black and white. I feel like this can be very gray. But I'm hoping that you will offer some color to me, if that makes sense. So are we good to go? Does everyone kind of know the drill with the show? Yeah? Cool. I'm going to go through and just introduce all of you quickly. So Dr. Doug Thompson.
Is this mostly audio, or is there a video component?
There's a video component, and actually you just reminded me. I'm going to go ahead and make it so that it's speaker view now. There we go. So I'm going to start with you. I know you said to call you Doug, but Dr. Thompson, because I feel like you're the last person to actually listen to on this subject. I listened to your podcast with Tom Rosenbauer last night. It's very interesting. It was actually quite funny because Tom really prefaces the episode as though the world's about to fall apart, and I feel like it was actually a beautifully done segment, and I felt like you guys are both very respectful, and the book sounds very alluring. So can you tell us a little bit about your book real quick before I go on to introduce Kirk, Tom, and Bob?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I'll say a little bit about my background. So I'm not a fisheries biologist. I'm very clear about that in the book and just in talking to people about this. My background is fluvial geomorphology, which is not something most people have ever heard of before. I actually study the physical changes in river systems and how they kind of evolve. So every angler knows what a pool and ripple is. I'm actually one of the world's foremost experts on how pools and ripples form. So that's kind of where my strong interest is. I'm also very interested in the physical kind of restoration methods to kind of create those kind of habitats. So the book was kind of inspired because as I was doing work on rivers and so forth, I became more and more aware and concerned about just how many impacts we've had on rivers, both intentional and unintentional, and just how manipulated many systems were. And that includes the biological manipulation in terms of stocking activities and so forth. And so the book is kind of a questioning, what are we trying to experience when we go out to a river, when we're fishing, or just enjoying it for other recreational activities? What are we experiencing? And is it really all about just having fish in the river, or are there other aspects that really we should value more than I think are currently being valued? So it's kind of this whole idea about what is wild and how can we get maybe a little bit closer to what might have existed there than currently exists.
Yeah, great. And then Kirk, you're an old friend, and you were actually on season 1, episode 8, when we were discussing influencers in the wild of Into the Backing. So it's great to have you back. And you are, you write for everybody, but I'm assuming still the editor for Trout Magazine?
Yep, I am. I'm the editor of Trout Magazine. I'm also the editor of Angling Trade Magazine, which covers the business of fly fishing. And we just started this new venture called Fly Lab, which is product reviews that we're doing with Tim Armano and Andrew Steckety. So, and then I've freelanced and, I've written for a lot of other publications from Wired to USA Today, New York Times, Outside, that kind of stuff. So.
He's been
Gotta have a lot
around.
of irons in the fire, as you know.
Yeah. And then Bob, this is my first time meeting you. So Bob Mallard, if you're watching this on video, you can see Bob is named Emily today. Um, but Bob, I only know about you via what I've read and seen through the Native Fish Coalition. So would you mind letting us know a little bit about who you are?
Sure. I'm a 45-year fly fisher. I probably log 100 days a year on the water. Have always. I'm a former software guy who flunked out young. I owned a fly shop for 15 years in Maine. I'm a registered Maine guide. I've got 5 fly fishing books. I'm working on my 6th. Written hundreds of articles across dozens of publications. I designed flies and been a fishing advocate for over 20 years, probably 25. And the last 10, 15 have been focused on native fish. I founded a TU chapter called Somerset County Trout Unlimited in Maine. I helped found another group called Dundee Angling Society, which is focused on brook trout in Maine. And I was one of the founding members of the Native Fish Coalition, which was founded in Maine. We had no ambitions or intention of getting outside of Maine. We were simply picking up where some other groups had dropped off the field. And here we are, less than 7 years later, with chapters in 21 states, from Maine to Arkansas and Northwest and Wisconsin. So I tell people, be careful what you ask for. I was supposed to be retired, and now I can't.
You're here for good. Actually, we're going to have to dive into Native Fish Coalition as well, if you don't mind. Would you mind explaining to people who have no idea what the organization does? Just maybe explaining a bit about what your focus is.
We're fish conservation, and it's solely native fish. We don't believe there's any conservation in the preservation of non-native species, and we're not a fishing group, although pretty much everybody in it is an avid angler of one sort or another. And it's not a game fish centric org either. It's I've got a chapter in Ohio that does 90% of their work is the minnows, little obscure minnows. We're working on project in Massachusetts involving 100-year-old buried streams in the suburbs to see if anything still lives in there. So it's public awareness. It's trying to get fish into the watershed model. I mean, we've got all these watershed organizations who kind of walk off the field when the water's clean enough for Johnny to choke a little down without getting sick. And we've got, all kinds of groups worried about all kinds of things. But, we outside of the salmon world and probably the saltwater world, we lack an absolute native focus in the cold water systems, the freshwater systems, especially trout. So it's information education, it's habitat work, it's surveys and studies, and wherever we can make a difference. We're new, we're struggling for funding. The current model puts way too much money in way too few hands, so we got to pay our dues. We got to show what we can do, and we'll eventually get to that position where we're handling more money, and we look to do habitat work differently than the way it's been done over the years. But it's mostly anglers, it's young people. It's by far the youngest boarding centric org I've ever belonged to. It's by far the most diverse, way more women and involved than there is in any other group I ever belonged to. And so it's new, it's fresh. It's it's your friends, it's your neighbors, it's your family, it's your customers, your readers. And it's not a threat. I tell people it's not a subtraction. It's an addition. It's bringing new people into the fold in regard to becoming fly fishers or whatever fishers. And so it's just a matter of making sure people, I like the opportunity to speak for ourselves. It's getting kind of old to hear people speak for us and tell us what we think we're doing. And I can tell you exactly what we're doing and not doing and would do and wouldn't do.
Yeah, I understand. That's one of the reasons I love this show is everybody can actually speak. It's not just one person at a time, which brings me to you, Tom, because I actually enjoyed listening to you 2 days ago on Dave's podcast, also discussing just
Okay.
a number of things. But it was great to hear your
Right.
voice because it's been, I don't think I've seen you since I podcasted you for Anchored a few years. Well, Adelaide
Yeah,
was
it's
was
been
a
a while.
baby.
Yeah, I don't miss having to go to Florida in the middle of July.
Yeah.
That's where we were for that event. I publish and edit the Drake magazine. Guided for a number of years up in Jackson, Wyoming. I currently split my time between Oregon and Denver, Colorado. I was born and raised out here, so I have a strong connection to steelhead and salmon. I need to clarify, Doug. So, are you untapped fly fishing? Is that?
No.
Oh, okay. Okay.
That's James Polarizing.
Oh, okay. Okay. I was going to say that I do have one thing in common with that guy. It appears we both root for shitty football teams, college football teams. But yeah, that's what I do. I have the Drake magazine.
Yes, you do, and have for decades now.
Yeah. Yeah. 26, 27 years, something like that.
Yeah.
Long time.
Yeah, so James actually was the one who kind of brought all this to my attention. I was just mindlessly going about my ignorant business. And James, this is months ago, was all up on me to, get the subject on, not on Into the Backing, but on Anchored. And had questions for Chris Wood. And then Chris Hunt had published a piece. And then James had published something. Anyway, it got really messy real fast. And I started looking at the names of who was involved in this messiness, and I realized this is something where they're all very smart, good people. Let's sit down and talk about it. Now, obviously, I'd love to have Chris and James here. There's only so much room on the show, and so I'm here with you, gentlemen. But why? I mean, let's start there. Why is it so bloody messy?
Fear of change, incrementalism, a belief that this new movement, this native fish movement, is more than it is. I deal with it every day. I take calls. I answer, dozens of emails a day, and there's this belief out there for some reason that it's a threat to the sport, it's a threat to the industry, it's a threat to the bighorn, it's a threat to the leaf fairy, whatever. And it couldn't be further from the truth. As someone who has been in the industry for a long time, it's not going away. And nobody's going into the bighorn to pull brown trout out of there. It couldn't be done if you wanted to. So I think it's misunderstanding. I think it's fear of change as much as anything. I think if all these people sat down and had a beer like I am having right now, they probably agree on more than they disagree.
Yeah. What do you think, Kirk?
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's not a bloody divide. That's, if you ask 99% of anglers, do they value native trout? Of course. It's like native first, wild second, and then anything else that doesn't interfere with the other two third. So we all have different degrees to which we embrace that philosophy, but would I ever advocate planting brown trout over native brook trout? No, of course not. But I grew up in the Great Lakes, right? Probably the most manipulated ecosystem in the world as far as fish. I was born in the same year that they put Pacific salmon in the Great Lakes. So, I kind of personally see a what is. I work for Trout Unlimited. Trout Unlimited was founded in Upper Michigan to, get away from stocking fish. That was the goal. But they wanted wild reproduction, and it was brown trout that they were talking about. So, and there are just varying degrees of, where your line in the sand is. I just don't think I don't think it has to be a bloody discussion at all. I think that if people have cool heads and listen to each other, realize they've got two ears and one mouth for a reason, well, we could sort through this pretty quickly.
I think it's that line in the sand. That's the problem, is that people think they know where that line in the sand is, and in most cases they don't. I mean, 99% of the questions I answer, the person says, damn, that's not what I expected. And I said, well, what did you expect? Nobody's going to the Great Lakes to eradicate specific salmon. It couldn't be done. Steelhead, I mean, it's not going to happen. And, so that's, the misconception is, where's this line and why? And how do we all work together to make sure people understand what that line is? We need people to stop saying they think they know where the line is. They need to ask where that line is. They're right up to specific waters. I'm willing to answer anything anybody throws at me in a fair and honest manner. It doesn't, might not like it, but it'll be honest and accurate.
What is the number one question that you get? Or if you had to try to summarize the question, what would it be? And I ask Bob, I've got to give you some context. I have always heard, and this is long before thinking about this episode, I've always heard that Native Fish Coalition is quite radical. Now, radical doesn't mean bad in my world. It just means very dedicated to their cause. Can you address both those things? Is it radical? And what are the main questions that you get?
We're not spiking trees and cracking dams. I can assure you, we're blowing up hatcheries. That's again, that radical claim. What that is people who are afraid of change, who are trying to paint it as something it isn't. There's nothing radical about it. These, as I said, these are kids. These are young people. They could be your cousins, your brother, your sister. I'm just shocked that there are people within our own industry who are, accusing really well-meaning, young, hard-working, normal people of any form of radicalism. I've never been arrested in my life, and I don't think many of our members have either. So, part of it is it's mudslinging, and the mudslinging needs to stop. There's nothing radical about it. It's very pragmatic, and that's where, the specific questions, it's hard to answer where that line in the sand is. What I will tell you is NFP does not get involved with naturalized natives in any way, shape, or form. We don't see that as, valid conservation, because it really isn't. That's no different than preserving Norway rats or pike and bass water and bass and trout water. I mean, so most of the noise comes from, the brown trout community. Brown trout are incredibly popular, and for, recreationally valid reasons. People say, you must, shun brown trout water. I said, my home water is brown trout water. I fish it without guilt. I fish it because it's closed. I fish it because it's, I didn't do it. They're there to stay. Nobody's getting rid of them. And, so you do what you can. But, it's more about saving what's left and restoring, what you can. And what you can is very small. It's a minuscule percentage of the overall total of fishable miles we have in the country. And it's typically not big water. The best we can hope for is, to take some of these places. I was Matt Sapinski. I talked to him over and over about brown trout. And I say, the brown trout that we would ever go after, they're not the brown trout you care about. They're stunted little tiny browns sitting in brook trout waters. And so that's that's this great misconception. How it got out there, who knows? But it's I've been a sportsman my whole life. Nobody's worse when it comes to camel nose. We're terrible. And, it's anything that anybody ever says against, what they perceive to be against sporting is the end of the world. I tell people they've been taking my, guns and whatever else away for like 50 years. They're doing a really terrible job. That's their goal. And, so That's not going to go away, and it's not what people want to believe that it is. So if you have specific questions, specific waters, specific examples of where would NSC be on a given issue, I'm all ears, all mouth.
Okay,
if I can chime in on the fear factor a little bit too. So, I mean, I think one really important consideration is also like who's making the decisions, right? So, I mean, we have state and federal game agencies and wildlife management agencies, and they're all on tight budgets, right? And they're looking at all kinds of threats to aquatic ecosystems, development issues, climate change issues, and I think you've got a lot of really good people there who are, really worried about these issues, trying to address these issues. We know that a lot of the income that supports those activities comes from fishing sales, licenses, and all the associated. So I think there's a concern that, if they cut back on anything that might influence fishing popularity and so forth, they're actually hurting their own budgets, right? And that's going to ultimately hurt their ability to manage the resources effectively and maybe do some restoration work, which I know that a lot of folks are interested in. So I do think we need to understand the managers and the challenges they're facing and so forth, but that doesn't necessarily mean their approach is necessarily the best one long term.
Yeah, we just had an incident in New Hampshire where woman in charge of fisheries, she just kind of unilaterally, after a year of behind closed doors, threw out this sweeping regulation change package. And, a couple of years ago, we tried to codify the one wild trout program they have, which is protecting 13 small brook trout streams and 3 ponds. And because it was flatlined, so we tried to codify it, and every angler in New Hampshire turned on us because we were, quote, challenging the expert. Well, that same expert just put together a proposal, dumped it without warning, and it basically would have abolished fly fishing only in the state of New Hampshire. It was going to kill catch and release in the state of New Hampshire. And all the same people who said NSC was radical for challenging the expert, there were 300 angry anglers filled the state house to overflowing capacity to beat this thing back. And, here's an example of where, kind of look radical to some people, and it really wasn't, because there's precedent for codifying rules. Maine has the state heritage fish law, which prevents fish and game from stocking never stocked waters, etc. So we just saw this situation where anglers who were against each other, all of a sudden, everybody's standing room only, and NFC did not opine in regard to the loss of fly fishing only waters. We said it's a social issue. We're not going to get involved in it. Most of the fly fishing only waters were stock waters, so we stayed out of it. We only opposed the removal of restrictive regs on the self-sustaining brook trout waters. We didn't even get into the removal of fly fishing or catch and release regs on a very popular and rock solid non-native trout fishery. So, this is where I tell people, you're closer than you think, and there will come a time when we all need each other for one reason or another.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear you say that, because that's a big concern for me, is that I see so many people, when you mentioned mudslinging, having mud slung on, thrown on them, and they're more like-minded to the people who are throwing the mud than they realize. And the last thing we need, I'm looking at the Thompson, and this is nothing to do with, well, I guess it has everything to do with native fish, but the bait fishermen fought with the fly fishermen, and everyone was so busy fighting with each other that they closed the fishery. We lost those fish, and that fishery is never opened. And I just am so terrified that we're going to see damage because like-minded people are arguing about miscommunications or silly things on the internet. I think this is going to be tricky to do broadly, which makes me wonder if we need to focus on a specific region. Is that possible? I know, Tom, you had mentioned a fishery specifically in your podcast episode with Dave. Would that be applicable to this conversation?
Barely. I mean, I think the reference there was, I think Rotenone came up, and I think that was actually I was referring to Soda Butte up in Yellowstone, which is one that I think would be applicable. The situation on the Grand Canyon, what I was really upset about and what the story was about was the killing of a bunch of brown trout. But that is a totally man-made environment below a dam, and the fish that they were largely protecting initially was also introduced rainbow trout. There was a concern for the native humpback chub downstream, and that was a lot of the what guided a lot of the brown trout killing. But I just thought it was, and do still think it's, first of all, just a really, really bad look. I think fishing derbies are generally awful. And to go down there and kill a bunch of brown trout in the name of also introduced rainbow trout made no sense to me. And I think the comment with Dave, where I was mentioning, I never know how to pronounce it, rotenone. I think that's what's used to go in, and it's what was used on the Apache trout, or at least initially, and it's been used successfully. And I'll be the first to admit it's much safer way safer than it used to be, and certainly the best tool that a lot of these fisheries people have, especially on smaller creeks and areas where they can go in there. It disseminates really quickly once it hits temperature, and it can be a dangerous substance to some of the other species, frogs and things like that, insects. But it works, and it probably is the best tool in their toolbox. When I mentioned Soda Butte Creek in that podcast and why I didn't like it being used there was a couple of reasons, but the main reason is the brook trout that they went in to kill with rotenone, and this was 2015, 2016. Those brook trout had been there for a really long time, and the concern was that they were going to make it downstream into the Lamar. I don't know how familiar most of you are with the Yellowstone, but it was the common fear up there whenever there's these non-native fish found in outside tributaries that they're going to make it down into Lamar. And they had been controlling for nearly 20 years that brook trout population by electrofishing on foot, going in there and stunning them. And then they, take the native fish out, they kill off the other fish. When they do rotenone, they also bring the cutthroat out, and they just kill the brook trout. But then this past summer they came back, and there's always a question about whether or not they were. I think it was actually last summer, 23. Kirk, do you know? I feel like they showed back up again. These brook trout showed back up again in Soda Butte Creek, and like the Grand Canyon, there's always a bigger lens on a national park, and those are the two biggest and most popular in the country. And they, now the question is whether or not they go back in and use the rotenone again. And I feel like when there's another possible way to go about it, and the water's small enough to use electrofishing, that I still think it's preferable to do that, even though both methods do affect the fish that are in there. The effect that rotenone can have on other species, whether it's bugs or other wildlife, I think is poor choice if another one is available. So that was why I said that about Soda Butte Creek.
Can I ask something about the canyon?
Sure.
NFC didn't take a position on the canyon. We didn't take a position on Soda Butte. And we took a neutral position on another big rotenone project outside the park called Buffalo Creek. We got hammered for taking a neutral position. But I'm going to read something to you. Then TU President Charles Goggin. This is what he had to say about the brown trout removal on Lee's Ferry 20 years ago. If we fight this, what will we say to Walleyes Unlimited when they complain about some coho recovery program in Oregon? Let's grow up. This is a problem we have to live with in these altered habitats where trout are a mitigation species. If the science is good, what business have we to be complaining about the efforts to save a native species? The National Park Service, they are mandated to, it's a resource first thing. It's not recreation first like BLM or U.S. Forest Service. So they have no choice but to go after those illegal mandates. I probably logged 60, 70 days on Lee's Ferry. I used to work for Motorola in Arizona. That fishery existed for decades without virtually a single brown showing up. And it's a valuable fishery. Terry Gunn made a lot of money working on the ferry. So when it came up, one of the things I said to people is that fishery is known as the rainbow fishery. It has been for decades and decades. It's got some of the highest counts of any river in America. And it originated with giant fish that succumbed to overpopulation. So when these brown trout started showing up, the issue was that economically, that river was fine with just rainbows. That's why people went. And brown trout are notably more piscivorous than rainbows. They're fish eaters. So they posed a much greater threat to the then endangered humpback chub, which the Park Service had a mandate to protect. I think they've been downlisted to threatened, but that's what that was all about. And Soda Butte, it's a stunted little brook trout. They could be in Lamar today if they wanted to. Those fish have been there for decades. They seem to stay way up in the headwaters. And, the problem with e-fishing is that it's kind of has to be an annual thing. It's manpower intensive. It's not super effective. You can take out tons of fish, but what we've learned about brook trout in the West is that no trout was designed by whoever designs this stuff to live in more marginal conditions than brook trout. They're at zero elevation. They're in warm water. They're in, freestone streams, gigantic lakes. They're in estuaries, and they eke out a living in oligotrophic lakes and incredibly sterile granite streams in White Mountains in New Hampshire. And when we move those fish to the west, that's like putting them in a buffet. We put those fish in some of the most fertile conditions in the country and then wondered why they exploded and stunted. And this is why the West has a problem with brook trout. And as anybody who fishes out there knows, finding a big brook trout in the bigger rivers is, I won't say unheard of, but it's extremely uncommon. So those fish, but, you can go up in a Cody and fish the North Fork and never see a brook trout, but I can walk, 100 feet upstream and these four streams are full of them. So they're a threat to, the cutthroat, but I think the park made the best decision they could make. Now, if those brook trout returned, it wasn't the rote known of the technology, it was the application of that technology. Somebody did something wrong. And we saw it in Big Reed Pond in Maine, which was reclaimed. It's a rare Arctic char, one of just 12 populations left in the contiguous United States. It collapsed under the weight of invasive smelt. So there were 6 non-native minnow species in there at the time of reclamation. 5 of them survived chemical reclamation. So, somebody did something wrong and didn't get them all because, it should kill all gill-breathing life. NFC, we're certainly not opposed to rote known where it's effective, nor would we be opposed to trying, less impactful things like, e-fishing and things like that. I mean, I've got sideways with Ted Williams over rote known more than once. I'm not someone, nor is NFC, it's not the first place we go. It's, nothing else is going to work. So, and And again, you couldn't road known Grand Canyon. You couldn't buy enough road known to do any good in there. So it's
right. That's just for small waters. Well, a couple things on your comments. I appreciate them, and I again, if road known works, and they should have gotten them all, maybe somebody put it back in there. Who knows? On the Grand Canyon, you've spent a lot of time down there, and you probably know that Arizona Game and Fish is actually the authority on those. They have jurisdiction down there, and that's not Grand Canyon up there. Obviously, that's Glen Canyon, national monument. So what the National Park Service was concerned with were the humpback chub, and that was the idea behind keeping the brown trout out of the lower river. But the times that you're describing were when that rainbow trout fishery was strong, and it is no longer strong. And those brown trout down there, I mean, you mentioned it, it is the financial aspect of that Lee's Ferry fishery supplies the tourism to that, one of the least economically advantaged parts, not just of Arizona, but of the country. And a lot of the guides down there were targeting brown trout successfully and got big ones, and had people that booked their trips there just for those fish, especially during the wintertime. And you're right about them growing up, getting bigger, and being fish eaters. But the study that came out just less than a month before I ran that story was that brown trout are not the big population of humpback chub are in the western end of the Grand Canyon, just above Lake Mead. And it's muddy down there. And brown trout are aggressive, but they're still visual feeders. And brown trout have been in the Grand Canyon for more than 100 years. I mean, they started moving up when they started doing the big high water flushes to try to build some of the beaches back and things like that. But you talk about electrofishing usually being annually, they were doing 200 nights a year. They had 5 boats that they'd bought for 150 grand each, and we're going in there. They just killed them all. And they had the bounty down there. I mean, one of the guys made 30 grand. And I just, regardless of what you think about native, non-native, neither of those fish are native. The trout aren't native to that area. But to go in and kill 6,000 sport fish, that's just not, I just disagree with it. The bottom of my heart. And so do the native communities down there, which is really surprising because they do an awful lot of work with the Grand Canyon Conservancy, which is an agency that's done unbelievable work in the Grand Canyon. Yeah. But I think they're wrong in this instance.
So, Tom, Native Fish Coalition would never have taken a position on Lee's Ferry. It's one of the most manipulated systems in the country.
Right. The whole idea is crazy. Yeah. We talk about below.
We were quiet about the rainbows because what the hell else can live in? And the fact that any humpback chub still up in those headwaters, tailwater, is shocking to me. That's not their
They're not. They're not. That's the 30,000 foot view. Those humpback chub have no interest in going 300 miles up to the tailwater, and the rainbows and browns have no interest of going 300 miles downstream. It's not in their, and it, when you talk about a tailwater, and you mentioned Terry Gunn, his book, you talk about
degrees
in the country where you have brown trout and rainbows living together. They just kind of figure out their own space there. And granted, those are manipulated fisheries. They're below a dam.
Beyond belief. I downstream of the Pariah River, whatever it's called.
Yeah.
I used to grab water samples and just put them in my hotel room. And by morning, I'd have, an inch of silt and clear water. And, the whole thing, belief from minute that NSC would get messed up in and a good, what they call, good non-native, bad non-native argument is foolish. The only thing we would ever say is at that time, the park had a mandate. One of the things that hit me personally was a bigger question should have been why fish that had been there for 80 years decided to go 60 miles upstream. Was it just the increased flows? Is something else changing in the river that's moving them around? We're seeing it on the Gardner River right now. Those smallmouth that are showing up in the Gardner River in the park, guess what? They've been 50 miles downstream for 50 years. And so why are they all of a sudden?
But I think we all know why they moved up on the Colorado. I mean, those flushes are flushing bait fish and food, and that's what brown trout do. They're going to follow that food all the way up. It was up to the Canadian Journal of Science to kind of point that out. Rather
that kind of manufactured fishery is going to go through boom and bust cycles anyway. And I tell people all the time, that's why we're seeing problems out in the Beaverhead and some of the western brown. It was a day when the Beaverhead was my favorite river in the country. We're seeing boom and bust on introduced smallmouth in Maine, where their numbers are dropping off. We never really know why these non-native populations boom and bust. But I remember when the ferry was, first opened, or at least when I first familiarized myself, it wasn't crazy numbers, but the fish back then were like twice.
They're huge, right?
Yeah, they were giant. And then I remember a point where, 16-inch fish would be the top fish in a 3-day outing. And crazy numbers. Now I hear the numbers have fallen off again. But, there's a place.
Just real quick to address that point, because you're one of hundreds of people thousands that went there in those early years and remember those great fishing years. And the explanation for that in general is that Lake Powell was still filling. So you had an awful lot of food being pushed down through that dam as that water was coming up into Lake Powell and feeding those fish down there, the microinvertebrates and scuds, just a lot more of that food was coming through than after the lake got full. And they tried to introduce, they had bug flows for a while to try to produce some more bugs down there and things like that. And it just didn't happen. And eventually, as you point out, they got smaller. They got skinnier.
I mean, it's I think, as you know, it's 34 species of midge or something. It's like 90% diet in there. So, but there's an example of, anybody who believes NFC would take a aggressive position on Lee's Ferry certainly doesn't know NFC any more than we'd get involved in the Bighorn or the San Juan. We're not worried about what's going on in, the Beaverhead right now. Recreationally, I am. It was an incredible fishery in its day, and it's kind of sad to see where it is. But those aren't the places where a group like NFC would play. Why would you spend any effort at all in what's economically, socially, and biologically futile?
I wasn't thinking of any conservation group, to be honest, when I wrote that piece. I was thinking about the guides that have been down there 40 years and were making a living, and that there's just not a lot of other ways to earn a living in those communities.
There's no other way of living.
Kirk, are you seeing any action in your backyard, in your region? Where is the controversy? I'm not specifically the NFC, just the wild fish native controversy happening near you, somewhere that's close to your heart.
Oh, again, I'm not feeling any major controversy, where we have the controversy might be a larger controversy would be, have we identified the strain of greenback cutthroat trout? Or, like when Dr. Benke was alive, he thought that they had the greenbacks, and then they thought that they found this population of true greenbacks that were actually in the Arkansas River drainage, and so on. So it's like putting the pickup sticks back together. But they have reintroduced, they've had them around long enough to put greenbacks back in the part of the state where the greenbacks are. they've had to build fish barriers up in the parks, and sometimes that doesn't look like the most natural thing, to be honest with you. But they have to be certain height and have, accommodate so that the fish can't jump up and over it and intermix with. So I don't see, there's good opportunities that moves at a kind of a snail's pace. All these things, by the time you get through all the red tape, but not in my immediate neck of the woods, but in, we last couple of weeks, we've seen one of the greatest success stories in the history of native fish in the delisting of the Apache trout, which has come about after many, many years of hard work and hard decisions. I mean, they didn't fish for them. That's one way to do it. And they introduced double Y chromosome brook trout to outcompete. They moved away from rotenone at the end of that process and so forth. But, I think people are seeing what can be done. It's just a matter of picking and choosing your battles and where you're going to do it. What hill do you want to die on, right? It's like, I agree with Bob. Like, no one's going to come and rotenone the Colorado River and top to bottom, But, I think that to a point that you were making earlier, I think that one of the plagues of fly fishing is that we've become an or community. Are you a fly angler or a conventional tackle angler? Are you a conservationist or an angler? Are you a fishing club or a conservation organization? Are you a native fish advocate or a wild fish advocate? And I think that we need to have more ands. Like my quest now is to make it a community of ands. You can be a conventional tackle angler and
Right
fly.
here.
Yeah, right.
Totally.
That's how I grew up. You can be a native fish appreciator of native fish and someone who appreciates going for brown trout, or carp. I mean, Tom and I were just talking about fishing for carp on Beaver Island in Lake Michigan. It's one of the, it's funky. It's, carp are ugly and whatever, but originally when they were brought here, they were the prize fish. They were the food fish because they could live anywhere. They were guarded on Druid Hill Ponds outside of Baltimore in 24-hour guard because they were so valuable when they were brought to the United States at first. And now they're considered trash fish. And they do a lot of really shitty things and damage a lot of things. But, in the right context, where it is, where the toothpaste is already out of the tube, right? Let's see them, it makes one of the most pristine fisheries in the world. Flats fisheries, and you got to see it to believe it. It's gin clear water and 20-pound fish tailing all over the place, and it's cool. But it's ugly, it's gross. I mean, it's carp, but that's what I'm saying. It's kind of the make lemonade out of the lemons. And if we're a little bit more of an or community, I think that's going to be. That's where we draw our battle lines. That's where the mud gets slung. Like someone, you can't say that you like brown trout without someone say that you're offending native fish. Well, I think that I've done my share for both, and that's what I hope to continue to do.
So the point you made, Kirk, of this and versus or, the biggest disagreement that you, Tom, you, NFP, whatever, Mallard, are going to have isn't on what we will do. It's probably what we won't do. NFC is never going to stand up for the preservation of naturalized non-natives. It's not why we're here. It's not what we do. And so that is not something we do. We also made a conscious decision early on that we were not going to be a fly fishing fraternity because we believe, myself included, and that's all I do. I do nothing else. I'm a fly guy. I don't ice fish. I don't bait fish. I don't spin fish. However, I don't believe it has served us. And I think that the elitist tag hurts us. I have a project in Maine where we have to post 585 ponds, lakes and ponds, most off the grid, backcountry stuff, with signs talking about their legal protection. These are the never stock brook trout ponds. Uh, Most of my signs have been put up by, somebody who's more likely to have a Red Sox hat than a Sage hat, and somebody who probably doesn't own a pair of waders. So we decided we weren't going to be a fishing club, we weren't going to be a fly fishing fraternity, and we weren't going to get involved in naturalized non-natives. We said there are so many groups out there and people willing to go to bat for these, naturalized non-natives that we don't need another one. We need a group that focuses solely on, native species. It's like the Rough Grouse Society. We don't see them messing around with pheasants. We don't see Ducks Unlimited messing around with mandarin ducks or whatever. So that is, if there's any one misconception, it's this idea that NSC or other groups like us, because we're certainly not the first. There's plenty of these groups out here. The issue isn't, that we're going to disagree at the action level, because I really don't think we are. I think you could pick 100 places, Tom, you could feed on me. I'd say, nope, yep, and I think we'd all walk away after a beer and say, you know what, we're on the same page. Conversely, just like we refuse to oppose the removal of FFO on waters in New Hampshire, PU was there in force to preserve the fly fishing only reg, and we took some heat for not, supporting it. But I said that's not who we are. So it's there's many ways to be inclusive and to broaden the tent. We need the ands and the ors. And as I said, my home river, I spend most of my fall throwing blue wings that I can't see to tie on at brown trout on a 100-yard wide river that was once home to Atlantic salmon and fall fish. It was never notable trout fishing. And, it's, I don't think we're that far off. I wish people would stop saying that we're that far off.
I agree with you. I mean, I think, April, you're going to get like less bang for your buck, because I don't think Bob and I disagree on 95% of more things. I mean, people think that, we butt heads all the time. We butt heads on a couple things, but, at the end of the day, we could sit in a boat together and probably, like you said, Bob, agree on almost all of it,
And, for the record, we've never met.
Let me throw something. Let me throw an "and" out there that might generate a little more discussion. So, I mean, I'm really a strong advocate for kind of more natural kind of systems. And, I also tend to more be on the preservation side of things than just conservation. And so one thing I would love to see more of are just preserves where we just leave the system alone and not fish and so on and so forth. I think it's really kind of amazing if you think about it, that we allow fishing in national parks. I mean, how would people feel if, a person pulled out a rifle and started shooting the buffalo in Yellowstone, right? People would freak out. And so it's kind of amazing that we allow people to fish in these national parks, right? We don't allow, I mean, if you do research in a national park, you can't put a nail in a tree. I mean, they are so protective about these areas. And I find it interesting that there's not more preservation work in some of these instances. And I'm not talking about everywhere by any stretch of the imagination. We need working rivers. We need places for recreation. But I do think it would be beneficial for some more areas that were real preservation areas that allowed the genetic stock to kind of be protected so it wasn't experiencing the pressures of angling.
Some wildlife refuges, for example. I mean, they're called wildlife refuges.
But I mean, they're pretty far and few between.
Yeah, so Doug, we stood up for exactly that in New Hampshire. Not so much closure, I don't believe. I think closures and stuff pretty extreme. I think nobody's going to buy in. So I think you get as close as you can. And we fought to codify New Hampshire's wild trout management program because its artificial lures only tackle restriction was inclusive. Anybody with a fishing rod can enjoy them. the catch and release, fiberless hooks and stuff, we were trying to get as close to natural abundance, natural age and size distribution as possible. Stop the meddling where we don't need to meddle. And that's been our big push. The only time we're going to push for regulations is to, either something's horribly stressed or we're trying to get back to some semblance of natural systems. Doug and I just visited a place that's under an incredible heavy-handed construction. I was stunned. I was sick to my stomach looking at it. I'd like to add one quick thing. Several people, when I told them what I was going to do on this, a couple of people said, well, don't you and Kirk butt heads? I said, you know what? I've never met Kirk to butt his head. Somebody said, what about you and Bie? I said, I wouldn't know Bie if I tripped over. And and we do have a lot of mutual friends who, the same thing. They're like, and I said, Tom wants to get on a boat. Kirk wants to get in a boat. We'll put a cooler of beer in and we'll split the duty on the oars and we would have a blast. It's not that heavy. It's really not the problem people seem to want to think it is. If you're in this as long as the three of us have been in it, you have thick skin. You have to have thick skin. It's not personal,
Yeah,
well, especially if you're a writer, right, or an editor, you're gonna hear from the peanut gallery. You're gonna hear from other people. One thing I would say, Doug, this might shock you, but as the angling trade, business of fly fishing, I'd be all about that. I'd be all about seeing some, refuge water, just for the sake of science, just for the sake of seeing what could happen, right? So, and I've been fortunate. I've been to places. April, I've been to Tasmania in Australia and the Western Highlands, and you go back and hike for miles into these lagoons there, and the fish are so unpressured. They might see, 2 anglers a year in some of these places, and they do weird things. They're brown trout. They'll crash into the bushes to shake the little frogs out of the trees to eat them, and freaky stuff like that. Where you can, for me, rather than pulling on the fish, seeing that and understanding what kind of adapting is going on is way more fascinating. And so that's part one. And part two, April, to drop a puck to start another topic for you sometime down the road. But like this industrialization of fly fishing, where you've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people floating down the river, trying to catch as many as they can. And how big and how many is the standard on the bighorn and whatever. And some of those places have turned into absolute shit shows, and it's going to implode. That's a far greater threat to how anglers interact with the resources is in and of itself a conservation concern, right? So I would love nothing more than a control to see what happens in a watershed where they're not pressured, and then compare that to what we're seeing on a daily basis. And it's increasing in momentum as we go, right? But that's a whole nother topic. Sorry to do that, April.
No, that's okay. We covered a bit of that in our last episode about check nymphing. We ended up somehow, how these conversations go. We ended up winding down into a bit of that. Just real quick, I also want to say, I love this because I spoke with Kirk yesterday, and if you recall, Kirk, I had mentioned we've never had an episode where it hasn't gone this route. I remember, and I had referenced Ian Quarter and John McMillan in episode 7. I was terrified to get on air. I had the shakes getting on because I knew the two of them didn't necessarily like each other. And they went on to end up working together. And that's the whole premise. So I guess where I'm confused is editorially from what I'm seeing when someone does publish a piece, whether it's yours or James's or I know I read one recently that Miles wrote that hasn't been published yet. It causes, or Chris Hunt is a prime example, it causes a war. And I don't understand why, when in person here, everyone is so practical and logical and reasonable. Why does it erupt the way that it does when it doesn't have to?
Why does anything erupt?
Because there's no two-way conversation.
Tom, when was the last time you went on the Drake Forum? Is that thing still going?
Still is. I haven't been there in years, but just real quick, there's 588 refuges. There's a lot more than I thought there was, and I think some of them, like to your point about Kirk, everybody getting alarm. I just suggested that we ban lead on it.
Yeah.
And got pummeled from the conventional side. I'm talking about four of the 588 that threw out the idea of banning lead split shot, lead. So there's certain triggers, April, that people will I think if you got most of those people that got into fights online in a room, they do get along. They would get. I have not a set in stone stance on any of this stuff. It's so nuanced, and it might be, Kirk, you and I were talking about, one situation on the Henry's Fork is different than on the South Fork. Two rivers that close together. One of the biggest problems for me is that I just think that evaluating whether or not a species belongs it's a lot more complicated than just how and when it got there. And so much of the focus right now on this native versus non-native species, people, you want to think they realize that all those native species were also once invaders. We frame this in our human existence here, and the world's always changing, and some of these fish are going to be able to adapt better to the changing temperatures, and I feel like so much of that is discarded, and so much of the studies that are funded, whether through universities or nonprofits or whatever, the focus is on finding the bad about these invasive species. And most of them have been introduced at one point, and some of them have positive aspects to them. The one that's talked about the most out there, or at least is referenced a lot, is the tamarisk. For years that bush was just the scourge of the West because it took so much water, and it was originally introduced to help stabilize riverbanks, and then turns out it doesn't take nearly as much water as some of the native trees are there, and it has become a favorite nesting spot for these threshers that were endangered. It's just one silly little example, right? But it is sometimes these things it's not a 2-year plan. It's a 5 or a 10 or a 20 to see how some of them unfold.
Yeah.
I think it's also semantics too. Bob, you're using a term that's I like very much. I think naturalized, non-native. Is that what you were saying? Is that the? Yeah. Okay, well, naturalized non-native to me, as a descendant of German immigrants, just like brown trout were in 1884, is a lot less offensive than invasive brown trout. And I understand that scientifically, brown trout is an invasive species. I get that. But for someone who grew up fishing in a town with a statue of a brown trout in the middle of it, that word is inflammatory and it's offensive. So just tearing that down a little bit, naturalized, non-native is, okay, that's exactly right in my wheelhouse. I get that. That makes sense. That's coming to the middle, and that's moving that line in the sand in the spot where we don't have to get in an argument over that.
Kirk, do you know that those are defined specifically?
Oh, yeah.
1999, the Clinton administration, he actually had an invasive species council, and these definitions were broke down. But it is very interesting, the difference between an alien and introduced and invasive. There are specific definitions to those, and brown trout really doesn't qualify as invasive almost anywhere because it had been introduced by us at some point.
Both Trout Unlimited and the federal government recognize brown trout as, quote, invasive. There are non-invasive non-natives.
Right.
invasive, and yet there is
But they've been introduced.
but there's no such thing as an invasive native. You can also make an argument that in aggregate, multiple non-invasive non-natives can become invasive. It's like if you get too many non-native minnow species. We should never lose sight of the fact that a non-native species has an impact on, and it comes at a price, and that price is paid by native species, irrespective of how they get here. When we're talking about natural range expansion due to, I'm not going to go so far as to say it's unnatural because, we screwed up our climate, it's happening. If it's happening and we don't have a direct hand in it, then shame on us. We need to stop moving shit around. Where stuff has been around and it's so entrenched, somebody asked me recently about the whole, Jefferson stuff. I said, do you understand the miles of river between the Jefferson, the Big Hole, the Ruby, the Beaverhead? Those browns are never going away. But, so I stop short of, when I say naturalized, I guess it's a softer, a softer term than, something unnecessarily combative, but it's not making excuses for them. It's just saying they're self-sustaining. And once they're self-sustaining, in many cases, that can't be put back, in the gate. It's out.
That's right. That's right.
And so this is where people seem crazy to believe. Either they think I'm stupid or that everybody who's involved in it is stupid, that somehow we would waste any time at all picking a fight that can't be ecologically or financially won. I took a little bit of crap on the Swift River in Mass, probably the best wild native brook trout fishery in the state, because I wouldn't take an absolute position that these, they should stop stocking rainbows. And I said, folks, that river is the single most popular wade fishery in the state. Go after that river, every angler in Massachusetts is going to turn on us. And by the way, there's no way they're going to stop. It's their premier water. So move on, go to the next place. And so, that's the pragmatic approach, and not everybody likes it. That's a fine line to have to walk. It's hard to explain to people who want the absolute that, there's ecological realities, social realities, financial realities, and whatever. And but I'll never stop and say that these fish aren't bad. But I will say some of them are here and they can't be turned around. I would love to see grayling in Michigan. It really bothered me to be driving around Grayling, Michigan, and seeing pictures of grayling on walls and shit, and not a grayling in sight. And grayling restoration on the wherever it's feasible, viable, in Michigan is not a threat to brown trout. Wimpy little grayling are not going to bull brown trout. And nothing I've ever read has said that they have any intentions of pulling them. And people who dig in and say, the damage is done, we can never get them back. Well, guess what? At the time we lost them, they were lost the death of 1,000 cuts. Habitat, exploitation, introduction of non-natives. It might be different because we're not doing a lot of the bad things we were doing at the time. So again, you remain open-minded, be realistic. Little wimpy grayling are not a threat to big brown trout, and it would be an ad. I will not go out of my way to go to Michigan, spend money to fish for browns, because I can go to places that are better. If I want big browns, I'm heading to Arkansas. But I would go to Michigan for grayling. And I know other people who go there. This whole native thing, we are seeing in the backcountry. These are glass people, fiberglass, Tenkara, literally at 200 feet. Somebody apologizes to me for bumping into me. I'm like, are you kidding me? I'd have, 90 people between you and I on, most, marquee waters in America, and people would just be muscling in closer. So we're seeing a change in the ethic. We're seeing people disappearing into the backcountry. We're seeing people who are appreciating, a 6-inch fish. I spent my entire summer chasing 6-inch fish, and I never see anybody. And that's going to help the problem that Kirk mentioned, which is our big marquee rivers are being loved to death, and we own it. We created that monster. We wrote way too much about it. We promoted, quote, fishing to a point where, our own Frankenstein is ruining the experience. So, I've said, I'm not going to be part of it. I'm disappearing in the backcountry. And I never see anybody. But, so this is an important movement for a lot of reasons. It's taking pressure off of the big waters. It's taking pressure off of stocking. It's making a whole generation of anglers more ecologically literate than the current generation.
Which is why we just did this issue of trout, Bob, blue lines, right? It's all about getting off the beaten path and finding a more adventurous,
Jesus, Bobby said your problem in my backyard.
Right. So let me say one thing quickly on grayling too, because people have interpreted that you and I were sideways on that too. We know the grayling were extirpated in Michigan in the 1930s, and the grayling that they're going to bring back are going to be, Alaskan grayling or, the same fish. They're gone. They're gone forever. So it's kind of like putting the elk back in Michigan, which is nice, like to hear the elk bugle or wolves in Colorado or whatever, however you want to stand on that position. I'm not going to get into that now, but it was 88 degrees also in Traverse City yesterday, and 90 degrees a day before that. So I wonder sometimes if, like putting an Arctic fish in Michigan is the hill you want to die on or what you want to fight on. But that said, you hit the magic words, Bob, and we glance over these things, but like in the right places, in the right situation to see if it can work and how it can work and whatnot. I'm totally in favor of that, right? I think it's a great idea, but you gotta pick and choose your battles. That's my opinion about the grayling. So as there's no misinterpretation.
I mean, one of the things that I know from my time in Lower Peninsula is that, my God, and this isn't science, this is my opinion, is if brook trout can't make it, grayling probably can't make it. With that said, if I was to pick a target water, and I am not the grayling god, it'd be the North Branch. I think the North Branch has a better shot of holding grayling than main stem, a stable probably never. I mean, Manistee might be too far gone, but let it fail, because the problem we have is if we don't try, then everybody's second guessing. If we try and fail, then so be it. We tried.
I agree with you there. I think that there is more damage done by the people who just stand on the sidelines and boo the team than those who endeavor to try to do something. So I'm in agreement there, but I would be way more judicious, and I would be really, really careful how we go about.
I mean, I'd like to see Sunapee trout return to Sunapee Lake. I'd like to see bluebacks return to range. Again, we got people digging in saying it can't possibly happen, but we're saying, how do we know that? We haven't tried it on modern technology, and who knows?
What do you got, Tom?
Tom's hands up.
I had a question for Doug.
Yeah.
So how much work you've done in this? It sounds like this is your field, but how much of an effect do you think all these rivers being straightened and made for their fancy front yard to look just right? I've seen a lot of movement over the past 5-10 years, especially of going back in and undoing some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think from the northeastern perspective, to me, the biggest impact on rivers is the loss of wood. Basically, we just, we don't have enough wood in these channels. We have a fairly young forest in comparison to an old growth forest. And people just think that a tree falling into a river is a bad thing, right? And canoers, kayakers, and stuff, they're cutting it out. We've had a whole legacy of straightened rivers and so forth. So yeah, I mean, these are all real issues in terms of the habitat loss and so forth. And I guess one thing I was going to touch on, so this is a kind of good lead in, we're kind of talking, I think, in this conversation a little bit from the angler perspective, right? But there's a lot more people out there who don't fish than do fish. And I think the big question is, how are you going to create coalitions with these folks? How are you going to get them excited and interested in this? And I do think that native fish is a way to get people interested. I think they understand, like, hey, this fish used to be here, it's gone now. Hey, this river used to look different. It's can we restore it to something that's more natural, that is supportive of the kinds of ecosystem and the full food web that had existed before. I think it kind of blurs the lines when you say, well, this is an introduced fish, but it's doing okay. Again, I don't think people necessarily can get as excited about that. People who aren't necessarily out there just for the fishing purposes. But I do think we've got a lot of rivers, especially in the East here, which have been hammered for hundreds of years, that really need some attention. And I think we need to get people excited about that, and not just from a, which fish can we catch when we're done perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Tom, this project that I mentioned earlier on, Newton, Massachusetts, where I was brought up, suburb of Boston, it has miles and miles of buried stream. They've been buried for 200 years when they colonized the area. And, so you've got a whole generation that, they don't really know anything about these streams. And all of a sudden, we did some staining and we actually found some fish. Now, they're golden shiners. They might be bait released, but they're reproducing. They were way smaller than I think you could buy. And all of a sudden, we have all these people who would never be interested in fish just clamoring for more. They're like, I can't believe you fish hippies found these, fish in there. And we see it in our Ohio chapter. Those guys and gals, they do mostly like snorkeling and weird stuff and collecting darter and all kinds of these exotic shiners, and they show kids on the shore, and they're reaching people that we haven't been successful. As a 30-year Trout Unlimited member at one point, and one of the things that I saw in my own chapter is we were aging badly, dangerously, and the industry knows that. When I was with Fly Fish America, I mean, it was a big deal. How do we make this industry younger, and how do we make our advocacy younger? So I really was offended when all of a sudden we stumbled. It was no master plan. There's no genius behind it. It was purely by accident that we have this weird little group we don't advertise for members. We don't even push members. We have these small boots on the ground boards. And this thing grows organically, and I look around a room, and all of a sudden I'm saying, holy shit, this is like what we've been trying to do for 40 years. We're young, and yet the biggest resistance I see is coming out of our own industry. At a time when we've all been belly aching about our aging. I'm 66 years old. I go into some of these fishing clubs, TU chapters, etc. To speak. I look around the room. I'm like one of the youngest people in the room. And that has to change. And I'm sure Kirk knows that. Change. And here we are. If you go on our website and you look at our boards, you wouldn't believe it. I am the old gray mare. And, it's incredibly young. So as Doug said, this is hitting a chord with young people. There's something different about it that gets their interest. And it's probably because they're more ecologically enlightened than we were. I grew up like everybody else, fishing for stock trout in, manufactured waters or warm waters that trout shouldn't have been in. And I didn't know any better till I found Maine. I live, if you're a native fish, I live in the best state in the country. No state has done a better job of maintaining its native fisheries than Maine. I mean, when you use the term trout in Maine, they mean brook trout. It's a really bizarre thing. If you want to say anything else, you better say rainbow trout. Because if all you say is trout, the person you're talking to is thinking brook trout. Mainers love their brook trout. It's why we've been successful in recruiting non-fly people, people who eat trout, and why we have the success with the support for native fish, because Maynard never lost. If these other states hadn't lost their native fish long ago, I think we'd be singing a different tune here. I think there'd be way more support for it. When I did my first big 30-day Western trip as a 26-year-old, I went off on my own because my friends couldn't come up with money and one thing or another. And I hit everything, the bighorn, the snake, and Flat Creek, on and on and on. And the fish I remember most was a cutthroat from Blue Creek. I mean, I caught some, 20 plus-inch browns out of the beaverhead. I caught some giant rainbows out of the Madison before the collapse. And yet the fish I came home that, stuck with me longest was a 6-inch cut out of Blue Creek. And that's, the challenge we face in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and places like that, Lower Peninsula, is that, they don't even know what native fish are anymore. And maybe we can do a better job of explaining the place they have and create more of them and create a demand for them and move on.
Well, I think that, Bob, that one of the things we can endeavor to do is to change the perception of what a trophy is.
Yeah.
Instead of how fat they are or how heavy they are or how long they are, it's about how native they are or how wild they are and how pretty they are and healthy they are. And I think that the younger generation, the ones that I've talked to that are getting into the backcountry for adventure, understand and appreciate that. Grandpa's measure of a trophy fish is a lot different than the one that's out there now. And I think we should build on that momentum and keep that rolling.
Where we're seeing that is in some of these states that give the awards for the slams, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, Wyoming was the first one, and those were all native fish. But then the ones you saw for about a decade after that was, catch the 5 trout in Montana, or, Nebraska has a trout slam, for Christ's sake. There's not a native trout in that state, but recently, over the past 10 years, it's been, Nevada, California, most of the Western states have now focused on going out and finding those wild fish. And Nevada's really hard. There's 5 of them, and really only a couple of them are fairly easy to find. The first 2 years they had their program, only 3 people accomplished the feat. In California, they're not as hard to find, but it requires a lot of work to go do it. But those programs have gotten a lot of publicity, and I think it's really cool that some of the more popular ones now are the ones that are focused on just native fish.
Yeah. I've got a lot of young people contact me about Arctic chub, bluebacks, because I've written a lot about them. And they're not easy to target with a fly, but they can be, and for years they weren't. And I had a group, like 5 young men that went up into Duvuli, Maine, and they backcountry fished, and they would find a cell signal like every night and give me a report. And it was funny thing was, like, first couple of days, some 16-inch brook trout, almost like they were disappointed. And I'm like, have you ever caught a 16-inch brook trout before? And they're like, no. And I go, but you sound disappointed. And they're there for the char. And 3 days into it, 2 of them got, 10-inch char. And that's all they talked about, was the fact that they had each, caught, a couple of them had caught a 10-inch blueback. Meanwhile, they were, throwing back some 16, 18-inch brook trout. And so I get a lot of that. These kids are saying, I want to catch a blueback, and I'm willing to put in the time. So, there's a lot to be gained by this. The model we have right now, as anybody knows, it's not sustainable. The cost of stocking and all this other crap, declining licenses, and so something's going to have to give. And if we could direct some of that traffic that Kirk doesn't want on his rivers into the backcountry, as long as they don't end up in my shorts, I'll be okay with it. There's a lot of backcountry out there.
I have a question. It might be glaringly obvious, and it's definitely a can of worms that we're not going to open right now as such. But what is your stance, Bob, on a situation with wild steelhead, for example, that have had hatcheries introduced? I mean, in that way, you are replenishing the species, but it's not the same fish, if you know what I'm saying. What's your stance on that?
I mean, one thing I think maybe it was Kirk that mentioned it earlier is this idea that the vat that we're putting out there, grayling, whatever, are not what was there before. From a pure biological standpoint, the most important thing about native species is presence and absence. It's not their genetic pedigree. It's why the wolves that aren't even the same subspecies as what was in the park are filling this niche. It's why, if we set genetic purity as the threshold, then you can kiss pretty much every native fish reintroduction in the country goodbye, because we don't have those fish. Had them, we wouldn't be putting them back. So that's part of the question. Is we need to re-educate people that it isn't about genetic purity as much as it is presence and absence. And when it comes to this model where we bomb these western rivers with northwestern rivers with salmon and steelhead with hatchery genes, I mean, all I would tell you, it hasn't worked very well. And if you look at Maine, who's done the same thing with Atlantic salmon, we're pounding those salmon in, and they're grown in these ridiculous sterile conditions, and then we wonder why you heave them out in the wild and they don't know what to do. There's a group called Down East Salmon Federation. They're solely salmon, solely native fish, and they've been raising fish in a much less sterile environment. And their fish, they're having, of course, they would have a lower yield at the hatchery, but they're getting a better smolt return. Now, unfortunately, they've had some disease and stuff that feds don't like. And, if it's me, I would go back to a more natural model. I'd let Mother Nature sort these things out and stop nurturing them. It's, to me, a lot of what we do with salmon restoration, it's akin to, raising pheasants in pens and then heaving them out into the woods and expecting them to live. And genetic integration, there's a bunch of things people need to know. One is that now with eDNA, we're going into places that we've stalked for decades. And yet we're finding that the amount of genetic integration between stocked and native fish is way lower than we expected it to be. And in some cases, it's because it's an unhealthy fish that doesn't live long enough. It gets caught too quick and preyed on and everything else. But, personally, I side with Yvonne Chenard on this. I think that the salmon restoration model is seriously flawed. I don't believe that these mega hatcheries are the answer. They're, it's like putting farm chickens out in the woods and wondering why everybody ate them. And, so.
Yeah.
Well, Apache fish.
What was that?
Those Apache fish that we're just talking about that just came off the list. Those are 30 genetically pure populations. 17 of them are the original, and 13 of them were created.
Yeah.
In a hatchery. I mean, there's good hatcheries and bad hatcheries. If it wasn't for hatcheries, there wouldn't be those big cutthroat and those big Lahotans in Nevada. But like you were mentioning about Bob earlier, Kirk, I mean, it's just a lot easier to trace now, right? Than when he was doing his work. I mean, to find out that those big Lahontan cutthroats in Nevada were pure, they took the sample off that big stuffed one that's in the Reno Visitor Center. That's how they found it. The only one that was old enough, and they could do a DNA test. And it wasn't 100%, but it was 97 or,
way closer than people think. I tell people, if you think just because we stocked, we've buggered everything up, then you don't understand genetics. and you don't understand these. I mean, we nurture. If you spend time with hatchery people, their goal is hatchery yield. That's the worst mistake we make. We want to get as many fish from egg to release as we can, and then we further bugger things up with what they call catchability. They want to account for every fish they stock, and what they mean by account for is in a friggin' creel sample. And so, we're breeding fish to be as dumb as possible and as domestic as possible so they don't beat the crap out of themselves in the hatchery. They jump in the boat, net themselves so that, everybody's happy. And thankfully, that logic is what kept us from genetically polluting everything out there. And it was no plan. It was an accident. So I'm going to throw another monkey wrench at everybody. This is anecdotal. New England has done a pretty good job, or Mother Nature's done a pretty good job of limiting the amount of naturalization in our headwater streams of rainbows and browns. We see mostly brook trout, even in mixed species streams. And what I'm now seeing is, and again, I don't have the data, I can't prove it, but I'll tell you, as somebody who fishes 100 days a year and spends a ton of time on these headwater streams, several that I've known for decades, where the rainbows were equal to the brook trout or superior in numbers, they've fallen off unbelievably to a point where brook trout are outnumbering them 10-1, 20-1. Same thing with a couple of places that had some level of naturalized browns. They're dropping off. And I can't help but wonder if this idea that we've been throwing around, that somehow non-native fish are more fit and more adaptable to this changing climate, we could be completely wrong. It could be the dead opposite. The fish that we're talking about, steelhead, rainbows, rainbows out west, brook trout out east, they've done this dance, before within, their history, which far exceeds ours. They've lived through change. They've adapted to change. They've survived and survived. It's possible that they might be the ones to outperform. While we put all our attention into this idea that somehow brown trout are going to do better than brook trout because of warming water, we could be wrong. We could be very wrong. And I tell people, be careful, because we don't know. What we do know is these browns have only been here for, a few generations. Meanwhile, these brook trout have been here for eons. And, I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember Orson Welles' War of the World. In the end, after everything humans tried to do to stop the aliens, they died because of some oxygen issues. They couldn't breathe, and they all died on their own. And maybe that's, where we're heading with some of this stuff. And who knows? All I say is don't ever give up. There's no, the only reason we lose, I won't say the only reason, but the reason we lose stuff is we give up. We make assumptions that it can't be fixed. And I say stay in the saddle. I'm not walking off the field until the field pushes me off.
Yeah. Steelhead are different, though. I would just say it's such a nuanced, river by river by river. And you look on the West Coast and, the number of wild steelhead on the North Umpqua is 10 wild to 1 hatchery because they take a different spawning route. Right. But most of the rest of them, it's the other way around. And I hear what you're saying, Bob, and I think with some trout, especially, that maybe they can adapt, and we will learn, down the road. But I think with steelhead, and you look at what's happening this year in BC and without the dams and we reduce netting. I mean, so many biologists always, I feel like it's a cop-out. They'll say it's the ocean conditions. But goddamn it, they're mostly right. It is ocean conditions. And a lot of times we just we don't see what's coming. And it's surprising. Mm-hmm. I got to say, I'm about 2 hours is about it for me.
I'm ready to wrap it up. My brain is on fire. You guys have been so fantastic, and I'm just so thankful. Thank you for coming on and just offering some clarity. I'm well aware that this is so situational, whether it's steelhead or trout, Pennsylvania or Maine. It is very much region specific. And I understand that it can cause contention for people, especially if it's in their own backyard. I can sit here silently and listen to you talk about Maine and the Great Lakes all day, but damn it, if you come to BC and you start throwing certain, wrenches in my system, we're going to have a serious conversation. Is there anything that has not been covered that we need to add here before we wrap it up and let you gentlemen get back to your evenings?
All I would tell everyone, industry activist, is native fishing is real. The movement is real. The movement is positive. The movement is a necessary adjustment to old science that we've been caught up in for decades. And if people embrace it and nurture it, we're going to accomplish some of what we've been unable to accomplish as far as, reaching younger people and getting back to real science and lessening the meddling. I mean, humans always think they can do a better job, and we're wrong most of the time.
Thanks, Bob. Anyone else before we wrap this up?
No, I'll just say thank you, April, for having the forum and doing what you do. It's been good, and it's been a good opportunity for me, I think, and Bob, to clear up the scuttlebutt that's been out there. We're not like the sheepdog and Wile E. Coyote that people think that we are. And it's been a good session. So thanks for that.
Thank you to you guys. And thank you, Tom. Thank you, Doug, as well. I'll wrap it up, and I look forward to seeing all of you on the river at some point.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll fish together. Make a point of it.
I hope so. Have a nice night. We'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
See ya.